The recycled air of the cramped aircraft cabin hummed a monotonous lullaby, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of security briefings, strategic meetings, and national addresses that usually filled his days. Here, seated in what passed for business class on this route, he was simply a man among others, indistinguishable to most eyes. His clothes were practical, bordering on Spartan, the kind that drew no attention, a deliberate choice. His face, though widely recognized on posters and screens across his nation, seemed to blend into the weary tapestry of international travelers. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, felt the strange anonymity settle upon him like a cloak. He preferred it this way. The weight of the presidency was immense, a constant, crushing pressure. Traveling without the usual fanfare, the motorcades, the security bubble, the deferential whispers, offered a rare, fleeting sense of normalcy. It also allowed him to observe, unfiltered, the world and how it interacted with ordinary people, and how ordinary people interacted with those they perceived as less than. He valued observation, seeing the system from within, not just from the insulated perch of power. This trip was ostensibly for a regional summit, but he had chosen a less direct, more discreet route. For reasons of security, yes, but also for this quiet, stolen anonymity. The flight was full, the cabin a symphony of coughs, rustling bags, and the low murmur of conversations in various languages. A flight attendant, looking harried and impatient, bustled down the aisle, attending to requests with sharp, clipped efficiency. He watched her, noting the subtle differences in her demeanor towards different passengers, solicitous smiles for those in expensive suits, perfunctory nods for others, a barely concealed exasperation for those who seemed less polished or spoke with heavy accents. It was a micro-ecosystem, the aircraft cabin, mirroring the larger world outside, with its unspoken hierarchies and judgments. He hadn't asked for much since boarding. A bottle of water, a small blanket. He preferred to be self-sufficient. But the flight was long, and the artificial environment was drying. He reached for the call button above his seat. The small, illuminated light seemed to blink accusingly in the dim cabin light. He waited. Several minutes passed. The flight attendant he had observed earlier passed his row twice, attending to requests from seats further ahead, glancing in his direction, but not stopping. He pressed the button again gently. Finally, she appeared, sighing audibly as she approached his seat. Her smile, when it came, was thin and did not reach her eyes. She hovered, impatient. "Yes?" she asked, her tone bordering on curt. He spoke quietly, his French precise, but with the distinct cadence of his nation. "Excuse me, madam. Could I trouble you for another bottle of water, please?" She glanced past him, down the aisle, as if already eager to be elsewhere. "Water," she repeated flatly, as if the request was an inconvenience. She didn't offer to get it immediately. Instead, she launched into a practiced speech delivered at lightning speed. "Service is nearly complete. We're preparing for descent. Cabin is busy. Perhaps later if I have a moment." It was a dismissal, polite in form only. She made no move to get the water, or even to acknowledge his request further. Her gaze seemed to sweep over him, judging his simple attire, his quiet demeanor, and dismissing him as someone whose needs were low priority. Behind him, in the seat across the aisle, a loud, boisterous man in an expensive suit, who had been talking loudly on his phone until moments before takeoff, scoffed. "Honestly," the man muttered, loud enough to be heard in the surrounding rows. "Can't you see they're busy? Just wait like everyone else. Some people have no concept of timing or service." He chuckled to himself, a short, sharp sound of derision. The flight attendant offered the man in the suit a fleeting, genuine smile, a stark contrast to the one she'd given Traoré. "Indeed, sir. Thank you for your understanding." She then turned back to Traoré, her expression hardening slightly. "As I said, if I have a moment." And with that, she moved away, disappearing down the aisle, leaving him without the water he'd requested. The quiet dismissal, the casual rudeness, and the public derision from another passenger. It was a small incident, a mundane slice of everyday life in a world that often seemed oblivious to the struggles and realities faced by nations like his. But for Ibrahim Traoré, it landed differently. It wasn't just about the water or the inconvenience. It was the look in her eyes, the tone of her voice, the man's scoff, the automatic, unthinking disrespect shown to someone they perceived as insignificant. He felt the familiar heat rise within him, the soldier's instinct to react, to assert. But he suppressed it ruthlessly. Years of discipline, of leading under pressure, of fighting a different kind of battle on a national scale, had honed his self-control to a razor edge. He remained seated, his expression calm, his hands resting loosely on his lap. Yet, internally, a storm was brewing. This wasn't the first time he had encountered such attitudes, though rarely this direct, this casually dismissive, when traveling incognito. He had seen it in the subtle patronization of foreign diplomats, the assumptions made by international media, the way funding bodies dictated terms that felt more like commands than partnerships. It was the lingering ghost of a colonial past, a deep-seated perception in some quarters that African nations and their leaders were somehow less capable, less worthy, still needing guidance or, worse, simply irrelevant unless they fit into a pre-approved narrative or served external interests. The disrespect wasn't just personal. It felt like a reflection of a broader, systemic lack of regard for his country and its aspirations. The man in the suit behind him continued his loud conversation, now with a seatmate, complaining about the inefficiency of the airline and, in a lowered but still audible voice, making generalizations about people who didn't understand how things worked. Traoré listened, his gaze fixed on the seat in front of him, processing the words not just as personal insults, but as symptoms of a larger, pervasive mindset he was fighting against every single day as president. This casual dismissal of competence, the subtle judgment based on appearance and accent, it was the same attitude that questioned his nation's right to self-determination, its ability to manage its own affairs without external guidance or interference. His thoughts drifted to his country, to the young soldiers risking their lives in the Sahel to fight terrorism, often with inadequate resources, facing threats that global powers had often seemed slow or unwilling to truly confront. To the farmers struggling against desertification and economic hardship, consequences often exacerbated by unfavorable international trade systems. To the dreams of a generation yearning for true independence, for the dignity of self-determination, for a future where their potential wasn't limited by external perceptions or historical burdens. He thought of the promises he had made to reclaim sovereignty, to stand tall against foreign interference, to build a Burkina Faso that was respected on the world stage, a nation that commanded dignity not because of its wealth or military might, but because of its inherent right to exist and thrive on its own terms. And here he was, the very symbol of that struggle, being treated as a nuisance over a bottle of water by a flight attendant who likely earned more in a month than many Burkinabes saw in a year, and dismissed by a passenger whose wealth probably came from systems that perpetuated global inequalities. The irony was bitter, almost suffocating. It was a small stage, this airplane cabin, but the play being acted out, the casual assertion of perceived superiority, the dismissal of the other, was the same drama his nation faced on a global scale. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a slow, controlled breath. This was a test, he realized, not just of his patience, but of his resolve. Could he maintain his composure, his dignity, in the face of such petty, ignorant disrespect? Could he see it for what it was, not a personal affront to Ibrahim Traoré, the man, but a manifestation of the attitudes he was fighting against as Ibrahim Traoré, the president? Yes, he could. He had to. His mission was too important to be derailed by a moment of personal pique. He would not give them the reaction they perhaps unconsciously expected: anger, subservience, or frustration. He would simply be. The flight attendant eventually reappeared, pushing a drinks cart for a final round before landing. She reached his row, her movements still hurried. He considered asking again, but decided against it. He would not give her the satisfaction of another dismissal, or himself the frustration of potentially receiving one. He would wait. There would be water on the ground. His thirst was minor compared to the thirst for justice and recognition that drove him. The passenger behind him, however, saw his opportunity. "Excuse me, miss," the man called out loudly. "Could I get a whiskey? And make it a double." The flight attendant, perhaps eager to please the man who had defended her, in his own arrogant way, stopped immediately. "Certainly, sir." "Just a moment." She bustled to retrieve the miniature bottle. Her earlier claim of being too busy seemed to vanish when faced with a request from this particular passenger. As she handed the man his drink, he leaned back expansively. "See?" he said, again loud enough for several rows to hear, glancing pointedly in Traoré's direction. "That's how you ask for something. Politely, and at the right time." He took a large swallow of the whiskey, his expression one of smug satisfaction, clearly enjoying the small performance of putting someone he perceived as beneath him in their place. Traoré felt a surge of anger, sharp and hot. It wasn't just disrespect now. It was performative, intended to underline his perceived lower status, to reinforce the unspoken social hierarchy he was witnessing. His hands tightened slightly in his lap. For a fleeting second, he imagined standing up, asserting his identity, watching the color drain from their faces as they realized the gravity of their mistake. The thought was tempting, a brief, vengeful fantasy of vindication. But he dismissed it just as quickly. What would that achieve? A moment of stunned silence, perhaps an apology born of fear, not genuine understanding or remorse. It would reveal his incognito status prematurely, potentially compromising his security upon arrival, disrupting the carefully planned, low-profile entry into the summit country. More importantly, it would be a reaction driven by ego, not a strategic response dictated by his responsibilities. He was the president. His actions had consequences far beyond a single airplane cabin. He needed to think not about his personal feelings, but about the message, the timing, the leverage, the dignity of his office and his nation. His calm restraint in the face of such provocation was, in its own way, a quiet assertion of strength. He didn't need their recognition to be who he was. Their ignorance was their own limitation. He shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his focus outwards, through the small window beside him. Below, the landscape was beginning to change, the familiar dry earth and sparse vegetation of the region coming into view. The flight was nearing its end. He wondered what would happen when they landed. Would the usual reception committee be obvious, despite the discreet arrival plan? Would his minimal security detail, led by the capable Captain Zongo, be sufficient to manage the transition from anonymity to official presence? He trusted Zongo implicitly. She understood the need for discretion, but also the absolute necessity of readiness and swift adaptation. The plan was for a quiet disembarkation, meeting the ground team away from the main flow of passengers. But plans, especially those involving security and unpredictable human factors, were always subject to change. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the descent and the local time and temperature. The cabin lights dimmed further, creating a hushed atmosphere. People began to gather their belongings, the rustling of bags and clicking of buckles filling the void left by the earlier conversations. The energy in the cabin shifted, a collective anticipation of arrival, of being on solid ground again. He remained still, observing the familiar pre-landing rituals. The flight attendant was now rushing through the final checks, collecting discarded cups and blankets with renewed urgency. The entitled passenger was finishing his drink, his expression still radiating an air of self-importance, oblivious to the potential turn of events just moments away. They had likely already forgotten the brief exchange, or at least dismissed it as a minor interaction with an unimportant person, barely a blip in their journey. But Traoré hadn't forgotten. The incident, though small and seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme of national leadership, had crystallized something fundamental. It reinforced the importance of the fight he was leading, a fight not just for physical security against extremist groups, or for economic prosperity and fair resource management, but for dignity, for respect, for the right of his nation to be seen and treated as an equal on the global stage. Free from the condescension and implicit biases that still permeated interactions with former colonial powers and privileged global citizens. It was a reminder that the struggle for sovereignty was also a struggle for recognition and self-worth on a human level. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone completely underestimated you based on your appearance or background? Or witnessed someone showing casual disrespect to another person and felt the unfairness of it? Share your experiences in the comments below. It's a frustrating feeling, isn't it? This story touches on the universal experience of being judged, amplified by the stakes of national leadership and the historical context of post-colonial relationships. The plane touched down with a bump, the reverse thrusters roaring to slow the massive aircraft. It taxied towards the gate, a slow, lumbering beast after its time in the air, a temporary, sealed world about to reconnect with the reality of the ground. As they approached the terminal, Traoré noticed something unusual outside his window. Below, on the tarmac, there was a significant gathering of vehicles, far more than usual for a standard commercial flight. Sleek black sedans, official-looking SUVs, and vehicles that appeared to be part of a security detail, and a group of people standing together near the jet bridge, some in sharp military uniform, others in formal civilian suits. They looked composed, alert, expectant, like they were waiting specifically for this aircraft, and for someone important on it. His own minimal security detail, seated a few rows behind him, remained outwardly impassive, maintaining their low profile. But he caught a subtle exchange of glances between Captain Zondo and another member of the team. Everything was proceeding according to a plan that was, perhaps, about to become more overt than initially intended. Zondo was efficient. The ground team was clearly in position and anticipating his arrival. The plane came to a complete stop at the gate. The seatbelt signs pinged off, the familiar click echoing through the cabin. Immediately, the usual scramble began, people unbuckling, jumping up, wrestling with overhead luggage compartments, ignoring the standard instructions to remain seated until the aircraft had reached the gate and the doors were open. The cabin filled with the sounds of movement and impatience. Traoré stayed in his seat, calm, unhurried, waiting for the aisle to clear slightly before making his move. The flight attendant from earlier was standing near the front of the business class cabin, forcing a tired smile as she helped passengers retrieve bags from the overhead bins. The smug passenger behind Traoré was already standing, adjusting his tie, eager to be among the first off the plane, keen to resume his important life on the ground. Then, the main cabin door hissed open with a mechanical sigh. But instead of the stream of disembarking passengers, two figures entered the aircraft. The first was a high-ranking airport official, his face serious and professional, clipboard in hand. The second was a man in a crisp, clearly important military uniform, his bearing erect, his gaze scanning the business-class cabin with intense, focused purpose. He was clearly searching for someone specific, his eyes moving quickly across the rows. The general commotion of disembarking passengers died down almost instantly, as people noticed the officials boarding. Whispers rippled through the cabin, questions hanging in the air. Is something wrong? Why are they coming on board? Is it a security issue? All eyes were on the two men as they walked slowly down the aisle. The military officer's eyes swept across the faces in business class, his gaze missing nothing. They passed over Traoré, then, in a fractional moment, snapped back. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of recognition. He stopped in his tracks, standing directly beside Traoré's row, his posture shifting instantly from searching to one of immediate, rigid, profound respect. The airport official, following his gaze and the sudden halt, also spotted Traoré. His professional demeanor faltered for a split second, replaced by a look of obvious surprise, then a quick, smooth adjustment to deep deference, recognizing the individual the military officer had identified. The military officer, a high-ranking general by the look of his insignia, took a few quick, measured steps closer. He stopped directly beside Traoré's seat and executed a flawless, sharp military salute. The sound of his hand hitting his cap was a sharp, attention-grabbing crack in the suddenly quiet cabin. The airport official, standing slightly behind the general, inclined his head in a profound, almost bowing gesture of respect. The flight attendant, who had been standing nearby, frozen mid-gesture of helping a passenger with a bag, stared at the scene unfolding beside her. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly agape, her face draining of color as she recognized the man being saluted, the man she had so casually dismissed just a short while ago. The smug passenger behind Traoré, who had been reaching confidently for his overhead bag, froze too, his hand hovering in the air, his earlier swagger completely gone, his face a mask of shock as he processed what was happening. The military officer spoke, his voice ringing with formality, respect, and a clear address of rank in the stunned silence that had fallen over the entire cabin. Mr. President, welcome. We are deeply honored by your arrival. The words hung in the air, resonating with unexpected authority and revelation. Mr. President. A collective gasp swept through the business class cabin, starting in the front rows and spreading rapidly to the back. Eyes turned from the saluting military officer and the bowing airport official to the man in the simple, unassuming clothes seated calmly in the aisle seat. Whispers erupted, louder now, filled with disbelief, dawning realization, and a palpable sense of shock. The president? Is that him? But he was just sitting there? He asked for water. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man they had seen as just another passenger, dismissed as a nuisance, and mocked for his perceived lack of understanding, rose smoothly from his seat. The movement was calm, deliberate, filled with an inherent dignity that had been present all along but was now, in the context of the revelation, blindingly obvious. He met the military officer's respectful gaze and nodded, a small, acknowledging gesture that conveyed command and acceptance of the protocol. He then looked briefly at the airport official, offering a polite, almost imperceptible inclination of his head. His demeanor was calm, composed, carrying the quiet authority that was his hallmark, yet had been completely overlooked just moments before. He didn't display anger or triumph, just quiet presence. He turned slightly, his movement bringing him face to face with the flight attendant and the passenger behind him. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His gaze, steady and direct, spoke volumes. The flight attendant's face was pale, a mask of horror, dawning panic, and profound embarrassment. The entitled passenger, who had so smugly lectured on how to ask for service, looked utterly defeated, his face flushed red, his eyes darting wildly between Traoré and the floor, anywhere but meeting the president's gaze. The arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by sheer, unadulterated shock and acute, public humiliation. Traoré held their gaze for just a brief moment longer than necessary, not with malice or gloating, but with a quiet, knowing intensity that conveyed he had heard them, seen them, understood their casual dismissal, and that their judgment of him, based solely on superficial appearance, had been profoundly, spectacularly wrong. It was a silent acknowledgment of the incident, a subtle, powerful demonstration of the chasm between their limited perception and the reality of who he was and the weight of the office he carried. Then he turned and, flanked by the saluting military officer and the deferential airport official, walked with deliberate, unhurried steps towards the open door and the jet bridge. The passengers, still stunned into silence, parted before him, creating a spontaneous, awestruck corridor. The rustling and murmuring that had filled the cabin moments before were completely gone, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence, broken only by the president's quiet footsteps. He stepped onto the jet bridge, leaving behind a cabin full of bewildered passengers, a humiliated flight attendant, and a red-faced, speechless businessman grappling with the sudden, sharp reversal of their perceived hierarchy. The immediate aftermath on the plane was chaos of a different kind. Internal chaos, a flurry of whispered exclamations and stunned reactions. As soon as the jet bridge door closed behind Traoré and his escorts, the silence broke. Whispers turned into exclamations of astonishment. People craned their necks, pointing at the now empty seat where the president of a nation had just been sitting, asking for water. The flight attendant looked visibly shaken, her professional composure shattered, her colleagues attempting to offer hushed words of comfort or perhaps sharing in her disbelief and embarrassment. The passenger behind Traoré slumped back into his seat, burying his face in his hands, muttering to himself, the memory of his smug pronouncements no doubt replaying horrifically in his mind. The casual dismissiveness, the smug superiority, had been revealed as utterly foolish, directed at a man who held the weight of a nation on his shoulders, a man who represented the very dignity and sovereignty they had so easily disregarded. For Ibrahim Traoré, stepping onto the tarmac, the warm, humid air a welcome change from the recycled cabin atmosphere, the incident on the plane was already receding into the background, becoming a small, albeit significant, data point. He was greeted by Captain Zongo and the rest of his waiting security detail, their presence a silent, efficient affirmation of his identity and status. The official welcome party was there as expected, heads of state representatives, military attaches, protocol officers. The formal reception he usually eschewed was now necessary, given the location and the purpose of his visit. As he exchanged formal greetings, his handshake firm, his smile polite but brief, his mind was already shifting to the complex agenda ahead, the sensitive negotiations with regional leaders, the security challenges facing the Sahel, the political maneuvering required to advance his nation's interests on the international stage. The small incident on the plane, the casual disrespect, served not as a source of lingering anger or personal resentment, but as a stark, recent reminder of the external perceptions he was determined to change. It underscored the importance of asserting sovereignty not just legally or militarily, but culturally and psychologically, of building a nation strong enough and confident enough to command respect on its own terms, rather than having to demand it or reveal identity to earn a moment's deference. It highlighted the deep-seated biases that still existed, biases he and his government would constantly have to confront. The flight attendant and the passenger didn't know he was president, but their actions, their automatic judgments based on appearance and perceived status, were a microcosm of the larger biases and assumptions that African leaders and nations constantly faced in their interactions with parts of the Western world and privileged global society. The incident was a reminder that the fight for true independence wasn't just fought in battlefields or negotiation rooms. It was also a subtle, daily struggle for dignity and equal footing in a world that often struggled to see beyond stereotypes, historical narratives, and outdated hierarchies. He walked towards the waiting motorcade, his stride firm, his bearing resolute, his gaze fixed forward on the challenges and opportunities ahead. The anonymity was gone, replaced by the weight of his office, the visible presence of security, the formal, deferential attention of officials. He was once again President Ibrahim Traoré, leader of Burkina Faso, ready to engage with the world on behalf of his people. But the memory of the cramped cabin, the dismissive wave, and the mocking scoff lingered, not as a wound, but as a point of resolve. It was a reminder that the most powerful statements weren't always made with grand speeches or military parades, but sometimes with quiet dignity in the face of casual disrespect, letting the truth of identity and purpose speak for itself in the end. The journey had been ordinary, almost mundane, but the lesson it reinforced was profound, strengthening his determination to ensure that one day his nation and its leaders would be met not with assumptions or dismissals, but with the inherent respect they deserved, simply for who they were, a sovereign people with their own destiny. Stories like this, where hidden identities and unexpected moments reveal deeper truths about perception, power, and the human experience, are fascinating because they tap into our innate curiosity about what lies beneath the surface and how we judge others. If you enjoy exploring these kinds of narratives, peeling back the layers to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, witnessing moments of unexpected revelation, you're in the right place. We delve into the untold stories and intriguing moments that shape our world and challenge our perspectives. If you found this story gripping and thought-provoking, consider subscribing to the channel for more content that explores the intersections of history, power, and human nature in compelling ways.